The first thing I just wanted to share, I have a book here by Michael Wishigrod, just to quote from that a little later, but we were talking about the idea of gratefulness, and the idea of gratefulness. Remember when last time we were together, we spoke about Dayenu, the song that we sing during Passover, and we said that Dayenu has a list of 14 things, or 14 wonderful things that God had done for our Jewish people, right? And the idea, if you think about it, what is the purpose of this list? I mean, why are we doing this every Seder meal once a year? The purpose of that list is to kind of inculcate gratitude. In other words, if God had taken us out of Egypt but not had done this, right? Not made judgments on the Egyptians, it would have been enough, Dayenu. So we have these degrees of things that God does for His people, right? And the point is, of course, again, is to inculcate gratitude. One way to inculcate gratitude in yourselves is to expect little, right? Think about that. What were the rabbis trying to do? If He had taken us out of Egypt but not done this, so we're expecting certain things, but we're not expecting, we're not expecting more and more and more. And so it's an interesting thing, because gratitude really is behind happiness, and gratitude is really behind goodness, if you think about it. What I mean by that is that the less one is thankful, if you think about it, the more one begins to see themselves as kind of a victim, and the more one sees themselves as kind of a victim, the more one feels the license to hurt you. And so if you think about that, we're entering into a very dangerous culture in the world today, in our country today, where you see these things on the news, and I don't want to get political, that's not my point, but just to look at it from a Jewish and biblical standpoint, is that you have these people who somehow feel they have a license to hurt people. And so these people, it's a game to these people. They come up behind you and they enact this harmful. They either hit them or hurt them in some way. But the point is that happy people generally are grateful people. I don't know. Do you know someone that is really ungrateful and happy? I don't. I really don't. So they're kind of synonymous. If we can name someone who is ungrateful and happy, I don't think so. The other thing I just want to say is that last time we were together, we were talking about the Canaanite deities and how Israel was tended to appease these Canaanite deities. And these deities were local deities, remember? And Israel was an agrarian culture. They depended on the rain for crops, and these deities were local deities, and Baal and Ashtaroth were local deities, and they were sexualized deities, right? They were not, and that was the revolutionary thing about the God of the Bible. The God of the Bible is not sexualized, but these Canaanite deities would cohabit, and they would act out in the heavens. They would act out these things. In the heavens, and what was tempting, the Canaanite people would go up to these high places and these high hills. And the term that I heard when I was in the Jewish Studies program at the King's, we had a professor that called it sympathetic magic. And so what these couples would do, and it was very tempting for the Israelites, very tempting, because God was one thing, the God who divided the sea was one thing, but hey, come on, get back into the rhythm of our life here in the land, and we have to, it can't hurt to try to appease these deities, because they were localized and they were agricultural based. So a couple would go up to these very high places, right, and they would act out immorally. What they perceived these Canaanite deities to be doing in the heavens, right? And they would act that out, and they would try to gain the sympathy as they became fertile. The couple, they would try to gain the sympathy through magic, and that these local sexualized deities would now make the earth fertile, and the crops would come up. But all that to say, it's kind of an interesting thing, and it really did. It was the it really just totally polluted Israel as a people, and they really succumbed to that, and they fell into that temptation. But one of the main points is I want to make is that God, the real God, the true God, is not capricious. You know, Pharaoh was capricious. If you got Pharaoh just a little bit angry, he'd chop your head off. And that's how these Canaanite deities were perceived. And so you had to coerce these deities. You had to whatever you could to get on their good side. But unlike the God of the Bible, right? The God of the Bible is not capricious. The God of the Bible is moral. And because we have a moral God, the true and living God, that we can argue with God, right? We can complain to God about His performance. And we know that He's not going to come back on us in a capricious way and kill us. That was revolutionary in the ancient world, to have a God that was moral, because it's a moral universe, and not capricious. And so, and the last thing, what has to do real quickly with this whole idea that we have today, this tragic, I call it the tragic side of Jewish giftedness. And what we mean by that is that Jewish people, if you not individually, we're talking about collectively, because when you think about election, here's the tension in election, that Israel as a people group can be saved and elect, and yet individual Jews can resist God and go into eternity without God. That's the tension, right? So, and that's what I believe caused Paul the most anguish over the Jewish people, this transition with the coming of Messiah and the New Covenant Scriptures, this transition where Israel was elect and yet not saved, if you would put it that way. They were elect, and yet they were resisting God, and this brought him great anguish. And it wasn't like he had a burden for the Gentiles, but he had anguish for his own people. And it comes because of that tension. But all I wanted to say is that this idea of tikkun olam today has no biblical origin. Now, I believe that. I was taught that. I believe it's true. Where is the origin of tikkun olam? It is Kabbalistic. It was taken up, I don't know how long ago, by the Reformed Jewish movement, and just run with it. And all that to say is that, so from its Kabbalistic roots, it's kind of now really pervaded the entire Jewish world, if you think about it. And with that, I just wanted, the innate desire to fix the world is not wrong. It's not wrong in and of itself. It's just not the priority that God gave Israel as a people group. The priority that God gave Israel as a people group is not to fix the world, but to evangelize the world. In other words, it's just like Jewish people as a whole were supposed to have a concern not just for their own souls, but the souls of everybody else in the world. That's what they were given to by God, right? And so they were supposed to be the leaders of really a global movement in the world of preaching the message of salvation. Now that's still part of God's plan. And this is what Paul, if you jump over to the New Testament, and Paul in Romans 11, Paul says, "For if their transgression was riches for the world," I was like in churches, I look, hey church, if you think you've got it good now, just wait until Israel comes into their election as a people group. You just wait. It's going to just light up the whole world. So it's not a bad in itself, this idea of fixing things, but it's just not the priority. It has no biblical origin. It's really very Kabbalistic. So in the whole idea of part of Kabbalah is that God is so huge that He fills the universe, right? And this is part of this is in the Jewish prayer book, the Siddur. So in order for God to create the world, He had to withdraw from His creation, and then He withdrew, and so then everything was created. And then when God came back to fill the creation, He broke sacred vessels in the universe, and so now the whole concept is to, in a sense, even God is broken, and through the mitzvot we fix the world, we fix everything. But this is not of biblical origin at all. This is purely Kabbalistic, and it is really very unfortunate because Jewish people were given a job description to do, and they are yet to fulfill that job description. And that's why I was thinking of writing a pamphlet, Jewish Giftedness in the Salvation of the Whole Wide World. Because when they come back into their election, think about it, all the energy, all the blessing that the world has received today in the sciences and the arts and different things. Can you imagine when that's redirected once again to a major testimony for Yeshua in the world? I say Jesus when I'm in front of the class because to drive the point home. Think about that. So this idea of giftedness is very important, and they have that. Anyway, so just before we start, any comments or additions or
Well, let me ask you a question. There's even a book that I even got at one of the Cocoon conferences, which was entitled Cocoon Alone. So I presume that there are a lot of Messianic fellowships and believers that take that on, but I don't know if they take it on more in a biblical way than and you said it was just Reformed Jews, or what? It's not in the conservative.
Well, no, I say that the Reform movement picked it up and started it, and it's pervasive. It's ubiquitous. It's throughout the entire all of Judaism.
If you had to give a biblical way to look at that, healing the world, how would you?
Healing the world.
Well, that's what that means.
Well, I would just say that first of all, it's the job that God gave Abraham was to be a blessing to the world. And remember, we said that Israel was a fishbowl nation. How the nations were to look upon Israel, and they were to see the ingenuity and the wisdom behind these ways of life that governed everything from economics to military to marriage. And they were to look upon that, and they were to be attracted to the law. The law was like the law was the draw. You see, in the Christian world, we have this negative concept about the law. But the law was the draw. Israel was to live this life. It was a way of life. It was a constitution. We're not talking about a dispensation of law versus a dispensation of grace and love in the New Testament. That's not what's going on there. And when we get to the Mosaic Revelation, we really want to try to look at that. But anyway, that's how I see that the Abrahamic covenant. I'll say this before, and I'm kind of jumping ahead. The Abrahamic covenant has three primary aspects to it. The Abrahamic covenant is one, it is central to the plan of God. The Abrahamic covenant, number two, makes up the major themes of the Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament. I can give you, we're too short. And number three, the Abrahamic covenant has not been fulfilled with Messiah's first coming. Every aspect, there's land, there's posterity, and there is a blessing and salvation that goes out to the nations. Each one of those has not been fulfilled in its biblical meaning yet. And so, do you realize that most of the promises in the Scriptures are not fulfilled yet, and they will ultimately, when He returns, most of the promises. And that's why I say in that little pamphlet that we put together, 4 reasons why Israel missed the first coming of Messiah, is that they misunderstood the mission. The mission of Messiah was not first and foremost to come and fix the world. It was just that's not what He came to do. There was a more important mission. How could you have a bunch of broken people walking around? I mean, a bunch of broken people walking around in a fixed world, right? The illustration I like to give, forgive me if it's harsh, but it's like putting somebody who has Alzheimer's in the most expensive, posh facility that money could afford. That person can't appreciate that. You see that? So I'm just saying. So this idea of fixing the world is not of biblical origin. It is fully Kabbalistic, and again, in and of itself, it's not. I'm not saying it's wrong, but it's not God's priority. God has a job description He gave to the Jewish people. the first coming of Yeshua didn't set that aside. It only gave it more substance. It made or because he was the Messiah that was to come to Israel. He came to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, right? What, is God not concerned about the rest of the world? Remember that story? Was it Matthew 12 or 15? I can't remember where that was. But remember the Canaanite woman comes to Yeshua and she says, she implores him, please heal her daughter. She was demonic. And he says, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. So so God is prejudiced? God is not concerned about the rest of the world? That's not what's going on there. Remember, the law had to be fulfilled. He who was the light had to come first to and through the people who were the conduits of that light. So you can say, so it had to go through them. Now, of course, the compassion of God is such that he ends up reaching out anyways. It's not that, but he's trying to make a point that the law has to be fulfilled. And this is why we get to our first illustration, and just to roughly go over that. Remember we talked about this last time. We have this great holiday, Simchat Torah, right, where we celebrate, we rejoice over the Torah. And the point I was trying to make from this simply is that we shouldn't think that Judaism as a whole depreciates the rest of the Bible. But the concept within Judaism is that Torah is foundational, right? I'm not depreciating the prophets, Nevi'im, Ketuvim. I'm not depreciating that. I'm just saying that this is foundational. Now, why is that important? If you remember, we turned to Deuteronomy chapter 13, verses 1 through 5. This has great implications for our understanding of the New Testament, because any understanding of what came later, right? Any understanding, any interpretation of what came later has to be consistent with what came before. So you get up to here, and this is the problem today. It's that is that people are reading back into what came before, and it's not that they're bringing nuance to it. They're actually changing and reinterpreting what came before, and that's just problematic. So we've got this holiday, Simchat Torah, and it reminds us. I think it's a blessing within Messianic Jewish circles, and it's not in the church yet, but it reminds us how foundational the Bible is. And truth builds upon truth. And so, yes, what came later can bring some light to what came before, but it can't essentially reinterpret. It can't change the essential meaning of what came before. And that's the only reason. And so I thought that was a good way to start. Because and of course this is the implication, I believe, of Deuteronomy 13 with the false prophets, because a false prophet could, of course, God could allow what he prophesied to come to pass, but that wasn't the issue. The issue was the people. Are you causing the people to go astray from my law, from my principles, from my statutes here? So Jewish tradition, all in all, to say, has venerated this above all other. They venerated this above all other revelation, right? And the reason for that is clear, simply because this happens to be foundational, right? All other revelation is tested by its consistency to this. So anything that comes later can bring nuance, but it really can't. And that's a really key thing. I'll tell you, if you just get to that point alone, in a predominantly Gentile church world, I mean, you said a lot, because people quote all the time, pull things out of this and apply it right away to the church. And I always say the text, it has one meaning and 1,000 applications, right? So the text has one meaning. We read the text straightforwardly, what the author intended, what the audience understood within the historical time frame of that day. That's how we're to read the text. But so that all that to say that, and we talked a little bit about the call of Abraham. We started with that. Jewish history begins with Abraham, right? Although the term Jew, by the way, it's a funny thing, because we're in like church world circles. You hear the people will be talking. They find out, you have a Jewish background and stuff, and they'll say, "Oh yeah, I was talking to those Jews over there." And I always like to say, well, you have to kind of watch that. It's probably better for you because I was talking to those Jewish people over there. Not that that's wrong. I mean, when you're in-house, yeah, well, we Jews or those Jews, but it just doesn't have the same flavor. So I always try to say, well, you probably just say, I was talking to those Jewish people down the road, such and such. But anyway, all that to say, but so Jewish history in a very broad way, we can say began with Abraham, right? In a very broad way, we could say that he was the first Jew, right? Although the term Jew, if I had a dry erase, I just got one so I can draw. I would write Yehuda, and comes from the word Judah, right, or Yehuda. And what I want to do this afternoon is just the first verse. I want to turn to, if you turn to Romans chapter 2, verse 28 and 29. So let's take, this is one of, tends to be a misunderstood text. Okay. So Romans chapter 2, verses 28 and 29. So let me just begin by saying this. We're familiar with this text, right? It goes on, he is not a Jew who is one outwardly, right? But he is a Jew who is one inwardly, and circumcision is that of the heart, not of the letter. And so right away, I just want to say to you that anybody just want to read that passage? It's verse 28 and 29 in Romans. Romans chapter 2, verse 28 29.
For he is not a Jew who is one outwardly, nor is circumcision that which is outward in the flesh. And he is a Jew who is one inwardly. And circumcision is that which is of the heart, by the Spirit, not by the letter. And his praise is not from men, but from God.
Okay, so this is, I like to begin with this and I like to begin by saying that circumcision is a metonymy for Jewish identity and lifestyle. In other words, something that really, it's like an interchanging way that Paul says, like he is not who is circumcision or he who is circumcised is talking about Jewish identity and lifestyle. Now, all that to say is that what's going on here? Let's look at this verse in context, right? So Paul is not making a statement here, and this is fairly misunderstood today. He's not making a statement about humans in general, okay, saying that all humans, right, are Jewish if they have a circumcised heart. See what's going on in context. Look at chapter 2, right? In chapter 2, Paul's main point in chapter 2 is both that Jews and Gentiles, both together, have sinned and need revelation and need redemption. They need a transformation on the inside, like Jacob underwent, right? This tremendous transformation that after it was done, right, it had an effect on his brother. Okay? So what does that tell us? That when the Jewish people come into their election, it will have a reverberating effect on the world. That's why Paul says, if their transgression is rich, how much more? So that's something we should look forward to. I always like to say, Paul is no ethnocentric Jewish guy who lived 2,000 years ago that just cared about his own people. Paul has a simple end-time eschatology. He knows something. He knows it's important to get Israel collectively saved because of the effect that we will have on the world. This is why Jewish giftedness becomes an issue again, because Jewish giftedness was primarily to win souls, in a sense, really. It really was. It's not that science and the arts is wrong. Those are blessings in and of themselves. But that was the primary mission for Israel as a people group. But anyway, so in context, Paul is not generalizing. He's not saying, believe me, it's amazing how many Christians you run across to and says, yeah, I have a Jewish heart, and I'm Jewish, and yeah, okay, I understand that, but that's not what's going on there. Paul is not generalizing here. What he's doing in context, he's saying that both Jews and Gentiles have both sinned. They're both in need of a transformation on the inside, right? In order to, and that's needed in order to enter into the fullness, right, of their calling. If Jews want to enter into the fullness of their calling, they have to be more than physically circumcised, which is an autonomy for Jewish lifestyle and everything. They have to be more than that. For the non-Jewish person to enter into the fullness of calling, they have to undergo circumcision of heart. That's what he's saying, right? You have to have this inner heart transformation because the physical is not enough, Paul is saying. And in a way, Paul is a genius. I mean, we talked about this. This is a spirit-filled genius. This guy, I mean, it's amazing. God arrests this guy and saves this guy. And he ends up writing a lion's share of much of New Covenant scriptures. By the way, I want to talk a little bit about why the New Testament was written, because that's a shocker. But so Paul he's like this spirit-filled guy, and Paul is kind of like doing a play on words here. Is what I say. So the word Jew, because the word Jew, he said, comes from Yehuda, which means God praiser or God worshiper, one who worships God, right? So the biblical definition of a Jew, biblically, is one who worships, one who praises God, right? So he said. So the idea is that the true worshiper of God, right, is one who has experienced this circumcision on the inside. And by the way, this term, heart circumcision, is such a powerful, powerful metaphor in Scripture. And as Sam was talking about teshuva and repentance, is such a key part of repentance. I mean, can we really return to God the way He really wants without this circumcision of heart, without this inner transformation? By the way, heart circumcision is the Jewish way to say new birth. That's all it is. A new heart, I'll put a new spirit, a new heart within you. That's just, it's the same thing. So Moses has this vision of the future, and he knows Israel's going to fall. He knows Israel's going to stumble. And he says that when you're in the land of your captivity and you're crying out, he says, then God will give you a circumcised heart. And that hasn't happened yet collectively, right? There are individual Jewish people all over the world coming to faith, but collectively as a people group, that hasn't happened. So Paul is doing this play on words, and he's saying if a Jewish person is to become a praise to God, a true worshiper of God, and if he is to fulfill his destiny as a people, he has to have both circumcision for the Jewish person. He has to have physical circumcision and the circumcision of heart. So we started with the call of Abraham. We know little about Abraham's life, his calling, right? We quoted last time, if you were here, from Thomas Cahill, The Gift of the Jews, looking at the challenges that Abraham faced back in that ancient culture of Mesopotamia and Sumer, where reincarnation was ripe. People would sit by the river and just contemplate the fact that life is so cyclical. Just contemplate your fate. Your fate is written in the stars. It's like the great the civilization of the great wheel. Sitting by the river and just contemplating on your fate and your destiny. You can't change it. God gives Abraham this gift of what we call linear time today. This is what Cahill really brings out, and also this professor Bjorker brought this out powerfully. That Abraham, do you realize the courage it took for Abraham to go on a linear journey, and the idea that things really do, what you did yesterday really does matter today, because we're going on a journey, friend. There's a destination to this journey. He broke out of that, and we said that in Genesis 14, it's the first time we see the word Ivrit, or Ivor, or Hebrew, right? I would say very bad Hebrew. I can impress you with one sentence, right? Ani mavin katsat ivrit, right? Ani mavin katsat ivrit. I speak very little Hebrew, right? Katsat, very little. But so in Genesis 14, it says the first time we read the word ivrit or Eber comes from Abraham's grandfather, or his earlier heritage, Eber, And we said that the word the word Hebrew actually means one who crosses over. So think about it. Abraham heard God. I mean, he probably, I don't know if they were purely monotheistic in that day, but he had within his thinking, he had the understanding that there is this big God, this really big God out there, right? And he's bigger than these local deities. And I think with Abraham, it was a growing kind of thing. I think historians look at that more closely. But he broke out. He crossed over rivers and valleys and mountains, and he went on for the first time on this journey. He breaks out of this reincarnation type of, big wheel, a snake chasing its tail kind of culture where nothing really good ever happens and you can't escape your fate. So just resign yourself to it. He breaks out of this and he goes on this amazing journey because he listens to God. And we want to say, so he breaks out and he settles in Haran, and from there he waits till his father dies and he moves on. And so Abraham recognizes the voice of God. By the way, at Sinai, this is a big deal. I know with the rabbis that we didn't see any form, but we heard something. So Abraham doesn't see a form, but he knows the voice of God. He hears the voice of God. He knows that this is God's voice, right? And he obeys, and God says in Genesis 12:1, go out from your country, from your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. Okay, so this is Abraham the Hebrew, and he's going out from breaking out, and he's going on this journey. And so let me see if I can find this here. Okay, so here's the text. Now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house to the land which I will show you, and I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great. By the way, you can't be a great nation and have a great name without being holy. God is not into making wicked nations great. Okay? That says a lot about our own country, right? Today, this is no longer a Christian country. It's like, wake up. This is those days. Whatever vestige of that was, that's not what's going on now. But God says, so go from your country, so to the land that I will show you. Okay, so that's the first thing, right? And I will bless you and make your name great. A great nation exalts the Lord, right? So greatness and holiness have to go together. God is assuming they're going to be a holy people, and they will be ultimately, eventually, as a people group. I will make you a great name, and you shall be a blessing, and I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you, I will curse. Now, right away, right out of the gate, this is going to be controversial. There are going to be people that agree with that and seek to bless the people through whom it comes, and there are people who are going to disagree with that and curse the people from whom it comes. You can't choose somebody. If I choose Pat, that means I didn't choose Donna, right? And I want to tell you something about election. I believe, we talk about this huge debate that goes on forever and ever and ever about whether we're determined or whether we're truly free. And I believe the Bible teaches both. I believe that we're determined and yet we're absolutely free. And if you try to figure that out in this life, you really just go bonkers. Because if I'm truly free and it all really depends up to me, I'm going to be like a worry wart. I mean, what's going to happen a year? What am I? Can I trust my own heart? But if it's all depending on God and everything is determined, then why even get out of bed in the morning? Everything. So I believe these two things stand in tension with one another, and I don't think that a finite mechanism can figure it out. I think it comes, but regardless, that's not the point. But these are the promises that they were controversial. But think about election. When we think about election, what do we think? We think about basically God predetermines someone here or leaves someone here. But that's not really what God is doing in election. You realize in election, what God is doing is he's looking around in the human race and he's seeing how we respond to that elect, that chosen thing. God chooses those people that are absolutely flawed. So he chooses Jacob, which was not the choice that most people probably would have chosen. Because Jacob is deeply flawed. And what this does is it brings out in us unrighteousness and pride. If we respond correctly to God's choice, then we embrace it and we enter into that blessing. If we bark at it, get jealous, get prideful, then we end up going a different way. So God is doing something with this idea. He's electing. He chooses a nation, and he's looking to the response of the world, how they react to that choice. And I know that's just scratching the surface, but I really want to talk a little more about election as we get into it. But it's a phenomenal concept, really, if you think about it. God enters into a concrete relationship. He really chooses somebody, and he really loves that person. And he enters into not just a soulish, but a physical, concrete relationship with that person. He loves that people group thoroughly. And then the onlooking nations, instead of getting jealous, they see how God could love them too. They see how they can experience that too, you see. But election is a very complicated thing. And I know one of the reasons is God is testing us. He's seeing how we're going to respond to his choice. How did Esau respond to his choice? How did Ishmael respond to God's choice? How did the brothers respond to Joseph being elect? Joseph being chosen as the spiritual one. They didn't respond correctly. If they responded correctly, they would enter into that blessing. How did the Jewish people respond to Yeshua? In Matthew 20, they became envious and jealous of him, right? And so election, really, it's God's way of bringing our sin to the surface and showing us, and if we respond the way God wants us to, we enter into that blessing in our own right. If we don't, we end up getting further and further away. But I didn't mean to go into the whole thing about election, but I want to just show 7 blessings here. There's 3 primary ones that are yet to be fulfilled. Land, greatness, and the nations coming in mass. In mass, the nations. This is what the Jewish prophets talk about. The nations coming in mass. The church is just, all the church is just a smattering. It's just a handful, a remnant from the nations. That's all the church is. And there's a remnant from Israel and a remnant from the nations, and they make up the church. But the Jewish prophets speak of a time when the nations will be lit up. So, land, greatness, and salvation. Let's do that. But there are really 7, if you break it down. I don't know if anybody can count the 7. I'll just say, I will make you, if you can count 7 blessings, 7 promises. Let's put it, 7 promises here. I will make you into a great nation. That's 1. Okay. I will bless you. That's 2. I will make your name great. 3. You will be a blessing to others. 4. I will bless those who bless you. 5. Remember, controversial. This is controversial. God knew this would be controversial in the nations. He knew that. You don't choose somebody and not choose them without controversy. So he chooses. So number 5, I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. Number 6, and all the peoples of the earth will be blessed through you. So 7. I don't know. 7 is always good. It sounds good. I mean, it's
What if it isn't a blessing though?
Are we? Well, I think 7 is good. Now, a nation has to have a land. So a land is part of the covenant, right? And this is where I just want to show you this little diagram here. Oh, excuse me, yeah. These come from former times of, okay, so here we have, I hope the bulb doesn't go out in this thing. It's, one time in the middle of the class, I hope the bulb went out, and I was like, really? Okay, so land and covenant go together. I mean, God is a very earthy kind of God. You know, I said God didn't make a mistake when he made the earth, right? So God is all about the earth, and he's all about physicality too. He created us. Come on, it's just like so a nation has to have a land, and we soon find that the promise of the land is part of this covenant. And if we jump down to Genesis 12 verse 7, we were in Genesis 12 verses 1 to 3, but if we jump down to Genesis verse 7, we find that God says he will give you this land. It's the land of Canaan to Abraham's seed forever as an everlasting possession. So what do I want to say about that? This is kind of a little diagram, and it shows, it says the fulfillment of the land promised under the Mosaic covenant. So you start out with Joshua. Joshua is a type of a little Yeshua, right? Yehoshua, Joshua. So when was it Joshua 5, chapter 5, little Joshua meets big Joshua, right? Because Yeshua didn't just begin in the new covenant. He was there way before. He was all throughout the Hebrew scriptures. He was just everywhere. He's a big God. I always say we have to raise our understanding of how big Yeshua is. He is enormous. I mean, he is big. So little Joshua meets big Joshua, and big Joshua, of course, is the Lord himself, right? But under Joshua, you can see that Israel begins to take possession of the land for the first time. And remember, God essentially gave Israel the land, but there were major pockets of resistance that he left to each individual tribe to take over. Now, that says a lot about us today. God wants to give us our inheritance, but he knows that when we are very active and in our faith, and that it's good for us, we become more like Yeshua like that. So he doesn't just give us something. He wants us to enter into that possession of that thing. And so there were even though God gave the land to Israel, there were still major pockets of resistance all over that each tribe was required to take over, to take possession of, to take their inheritance. And so you start out with Joshua, and he gains a little of the land, and it kind of weaves and up and down. And then you have the United Kingdom under Saul, David, and Solomon. You get to the divided kingdom and then the surviving kingdom. But under Saul, David, and Solomon, Israel probably possessed maybe as much or most of the land that was part of the inheritance. I mean, it was amazing. People were coming from all over the world to see how the blessing on Solomon, his kingdom, there were people converting to becoming Jews. It was like, so they attained almost all of the land that was promised in the Abrahamic covenant. Then, of course, the kingdom, Solomon's son, Rehoboam, wasn't the best politician, right? And through taxation, what is that saying? You could get more something with honey than something. I don't know. More flies. Yeah. So in other words, whatever. He didn't. He wasn't the best politician, but regardless, the kingdom divided. And after Solomon died, and there was Rehoboam and Jeroboam went back and forth, and the kingdom, and so you get into this time in history, the first exile, the first return, get into the days of Hanukkah, where Israel weaved and came up and down, but they weren't in possession of the land. Then by the time you get to the time of Yeshua and the big exile, because that was the big one, right? The two civil wars, there was 66 to 70 and 132 to 135, these two huge wars. Israel is dispersed completely to every corner of the world in the diaspora, right? And so, why to bring that up? Because there is a concept And I think this is really, in the church world, I think this is one of the reasons why some in the church world embrace a covenant theology and believe that Israel has missed their time, and now that God has replaced them. Because if you were back in that day and you witnessed this amazing, almost like an apocalypse of some kind, of the temple and the Jews being dispersed, you would probably maybe conclude, well, maybe God is finished with Israel. Maybe God really is through with these people. I mean, it's not that far-fetched. I don't really get down or blame, back in that century. It must have been, it must have been beyond the imagination. I mean, Yeshua even says not one stone would be left upon the other. I mean, and remember, this was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. During the Feast of Sukkot, which is not found in Scripture, during the lighting ceremony, they say that light ricocheted off the golden face of that temple across the Kidron Valley for miles, and people can see that. I mean, it was just magnificent. So to see all of this destroyed, maybe God is through with Israel. But the thing I want to just point out, there's a concept called possession or promise versus possession, and it's kind of like this in a sense. It's like throughout Israel's history, as we said, obedience was God's condition for possession of the land. So, and the land is connected to covenant. So in other words, and so throughout Israel's history, as you go on through the different ages and times, we see times when Israel possessed more or less of the land, right? And that's just the way it was. Their obedience was, exile was probably the worst thing you could do, but was the worst punishment ever. Exile, right? I was saying that we might be in exile here in this country, because exile is more than geographic. Exile is where you just don't feel at home anymore. Everything that was familiar, words, meanings of words, terminology, things that you depended on that were absolute are just not there anymore. And so it's a type of mourning. And when Jeremiah in Lamentations he went through the city and he mourned it. I think you can mourn what's happening in this country. Really, just mourn it. But we are to prosper in exile. I don't mean financially necessarily, but we're to excel in exile. That's what God tells us to do. 1 Peter, Jeremiah. So, in all this to say, so throughout Israel's history, we see times when Israel possessed more or less of the land based on their obedience. But the point, all I want to make, is that possession of the land is not the same thing as promise of the land. In other words, and God will be faithful to His promise. And so what's happened is for 2,000 years, Israel has not been in possession of the land, but that didn't affect the promise. The promise was still in effect, even though Israel was not in possession of the land, and because many did not see this concept of promise versus possession. Because of that, many, I think, believe that God had forsaken Israel. But it's just a kind of a little way to show that under the Mosaic covenant, there were certain things that had to be. Judicial matters were very important in the Mosaic covenant because Israel was a nation, right? I mean, you had to have rules in a nation, right? Israel needed to have rules in a nation. But Israel, as time went on, Israel as a whole, Judaism as a whole, began to see the revelation at Sinai not as God's grace, but more of a way to obligate God or please God. That was the thing. Any comments on that? Have you ever seen anything like that? Just to step back and look at this idea of possession versus promise, and how people can really stumble over that, and that people can really,
Where do you get the maximal extent of the land that they're supposed to
Where do you get what?
The maximal extent of the land that they're supposed to possess?
Where is it?
Yeah.
Oh well, I personally see it as probably parts of Iraq and down into parts of northern Africa. I mean that's my sense of what you're saying. If they possessed all the land that God gave them.
I'm saying where, I mean, obviously you have some categories based on how much they have control for that graph, and I'm curious where you get the definition of maximal extent.
Well, where I get that from, I think when you read the historical books under Solomon and how his kingdom was spreading, that's all I would say. That just the fact that under Solomon, I think there's indication in the text that they really acquired a lot of land. I mean, nations were subject to them. People were coming from all around the world, the ancient world, to hear about Solomon and his vast kingdom. So that's all I say. I think when with regard to possession, it peaked under that reign. That's all I was saying. I don't know exactly to the extent of how much they had acquired. That's all.
I just wonder if there's a reference you had, like if they would control up to the Euphrates or.
Well, the reference isn't that reference in Genesis where they outline the borders of the land from the Euphrates River, and it's debatable what river that is, but I think a decent amount of Bible scholars say that it's. I know it's in Genesis. God outlines the borders of the land that is part of the Abrahamic covenant. That's it. So I mean, there's God visits that promise more than once throughout the Torah. He reaffirms the promises to the patriarchs. But that's where I get and do like a study on, what today that would encompass. There's some who've done that. I've not gone too far into that, but I know it's a lot bigger, a lot wider than what they have now. Yeah. Oh yes.
Just looking that up very quickly, it says it's in Exodus 23.
Okay.
It says the river of Egypt to the Euphrates.
Yeah, that river of Egypt is a debatable in Bible scholars. Some think it's a wadi, but it's hard to say. Some see it as the Nile, but that debate has gone back and forth. I'm not an expert in that. I'm just saying, but it's a decent size of real estate. Yeah, that's. But yeah, the Euphrates. If you look at the Euphrates, the way it's kind of it's almost like a triangle. It comes down like that's a lot of land. I mean, that's. Anyway, so just to continue, what time is it? It's like
1:20.
Okay, so just a little longer. I want to try to get a little further on with the Abrahamic covenant and Abraham. So the covenant is passed down from Abraham not through Ishmael but through Isaac, obviously, and not through Jacob and not Esau. So there's a specific line that runs through the covenant blessings. And again, election is not to be seen as that, God destining someone. It's a matter of God choosing someone or something, and how those people respond to that election will determine whether they are blessed in their own right or not. We tend to recoil at the idea of God choosing somebody and not choosing another one. Everybody gets a trophy, right, in this culture, right? But God is entering into a thoroughly concrete relationship with the Jewish people. And he's demonstrating how every nation, and what relationship, the level of the relationship that every people group on the face of the earth can have with God if they want it. Israel is just the example, it's the nation among the nations, right? But election is a very big thing, it's a very complicated thing, but at least to be able to look at that in terms of how we respond to election. But the covenant is passed down. God's covenant is offered by His grace, because the first thing that God says to Abraham, or He says that in Genesis 15, when we move further past Genesis 12, we get to Genesis 15. And what does God say? He says that Abraham believed in the Lord, and God accredited it to Abraham as righteousness. Now, by the way, Paul takes this on in Romans chapter 4, and this is a big deal. This is the basis of the gospel in the New Testament, that Abraham believed God. This is so Paul consistently shows in the New Testament scriptures that a right standing with God is achieved by a faith response to Him to the Abrahamic covenant. And this is the key to Paul's doctrine right here. So really, if you just turn to Romans chapter 4, I just want to show you something. You might have seen this already, but I'll just read it just to save time. But in chapter 4, what then shall we say? Abraham our forefather according to the flesh is found. For if Abraham were justified, declared righteous by works, he has something to boast, but not before God. For what does the scripture say? Abraham believed God, and it was accredited to him as righteousness. By the way, just biblical Judaism has always been a faith-based religion. It has always been. It's come to have a bit of distortion sometimes, not in certain ways, in terms of emphasis on the mitzvot. Now that's important, but I'm just saying Judaism as a religion is a faith-based religion in its deepest and earliest origins. I know the rabbis sometimes pride ourselves in saying, well, we're a religion of what we do. I mean, Christians say they believe something and then they act horribly. We pride ourselves in what we do, but it's really, Judaism is a faith-based religion because this was before the Torah, right? So, for what does the scripture say? Abraham believed God, and it was accredited to him as righteousness. Now, to the one who works, his wage is credited as favor, but as what is due. But to the one who does not work, but believes in him who justifies the ungodly, his faith is credited as righteousness. Last verse. Just as David also speaks of the blessings on the man to whom God credits righteousness apart from work. So here's the $64,000 question. Why, remember Paul's a smart guy, right? Why does he bring David into this 4th chapter of the book of Romans? Remember, Romans is written with an imaginary opponent, and that imaginary opponent is a non-Messianic Jew. Okay, that's how we have to read Romans. I really believe that. I've been taught that, and I just thoroughly believe it. So why is Paul bringing David into this? Yeah, okay. He talks about Abraham. He talks about Abraham. Remember, the faith Abraham had is the model that Paul uses in the New Testament for walking out new covenant faith and righteousness. He's the guide. If we want to please God, we want to imitate the faith of Abraham. But why does Paul later make reference to David? Well, that's true. I mean, there's probably more than one reason, but it is a primary reason. Why does God make reference to David? Because Romans is written with an imaginary opponent, and that imaginary opponent is saying to Paul, well, yeah, I mean, that's true, but David came after the law. Certainly, after the law, it's all changed. We have to, there has to be a merit system after the law. So Paul is showing that either before the law, Abraham, or after the law, David, that righteousness is always and has always been and will always be by faith. So he brings these two references together. So here's the big question again. When we talked about this lesson, what did Abraham really believe? What did Abraham believe? He believed God. Did he believe that Yeshua died on a Roman execution tree cross stake? I mean, what did he really believe? And why was it accredited to him as righteousness? Yeah.
He believed in the sprinkling of the blood of the heifer as a sin covering, but he was looking towards the Messiah that the Lord would bring to his line, and we look back to the cross, because without the shedding of blood, there's no remission or forgiveness of sins.
Yeah, I think Abraham had an idea, an understanding. I don't know to what extent that obviously someone was going to come through his line, his seed. Remember, Paul does a midrashic play on words in Galatians when he says not to seeds as many, but to one seed, as referring to Messiah. Paul does a play on words, but the word in Hebrew is zera, and it does mean posterity. It's kind of one of those nouns that has a plural meaning. So through your seed, through your posterity, one is going to come who will bring blessing. So Abraham did believe that. But really, think about it. So he believed in, it says here that Abraham believed God. He believed God, I see, in two ways. And we said this before. Abraham had enough faith to travel onward with God. That's number one. Because remember, back in Sumar, in Chaldea, in the Ur of the Chaldees, that Abraham breaks out of this great wheel, and he goes on this journey. And I don't know, to my knowledge, in civilized history, I don't know if anyone has ever done that before. I don't know if anyone has ever dared to trust this God, the true and living God, and actually broke out of that. Abraham perhaps was the first to listen to God, to hear his voice, and to go on this journey across rivers and mountains. And we are the beneficiaries of this whole idea of linear time, that we are moving to a destination, and that destination is the second coming of the Messiah to this earth. But everything. So, number one, Abraham had enough faith to travel onward with God amongst the ridicule. And number two, Abraham had enough faith to believe that out of the deadness of their two lives, that God is going to make a posterity like the stars of heaven. That's what we were saying, why you and I, although Abraham perhaps didn't believe exactly what we believe, that there's a great parallel to what you think, what you believe, and what Abraham believes. Because Abraham, when it was all said and done, believed somehow that God was going to bring life out of death. God is going to call things that do not exist as though they do exist. And he even changed his name before the promise came into fruition. So every time Abraham said his name, it was a faith confession to the fact that God is going to do this. And if you look at Romans chapter, this is a great section. Romans chapter 4, starting at verse 17, as it is written, a father of many nations have I made you in the presence of him whom he believed, that's even God, so Abraham believed that, who gives life to the dead and calls into being that which does not exist. That's the faith that Abraham had. And I said last time, you and I, every single day of our lives, exercise the kind of faith Abraham has. Now, we may not be successful in that, I'm saying, because you and I every day are faced with the promise, and you and I every day are faced with the visible reality. You and I every day are faced with the promise, and you and I are faced every day with the natural truth. And the natural truth and the visible reality is often it is a contradiction to what this says. So you have a chance to walk in the faith of Abraham. You have a chance to please God with exercising that kind of faith. And that's the kind of faith that God wants to see. That's the kind of faith that pleases God. So he goes on to say, in hope against hope, there's natural hope, and there's a hope that's more of an expectation. I remember joking around some years ago, we threw a message here that I'm hoping Johnny makes the basketball team. It doesn't look very good, you know. That's worldly hope. This is not the kind of hope that, this was a full expectation that what God said he would actually do. I really believe that Abraham practiced faith confession. He confessed verbally these promises out loud. He would walk in that kind of faith because everything around him was screaming the opposite. So that's like, wake up, hello, that's right, hello. Isn't that where we are today, right? It's nothing new. So Abraham's faith is key. Okay, so he goes on, in hope against hope he believed, so that he might become the father of many nations, according to that which has been spoken, so shall your descendants be. Without becoming weak in faith, he contemplated his own body now as good as dead. Think about how many times the word dead appears in this text. This is why salvation is essentially bringing something that's dead, bringing it back to life again. That's what it is. We were dead in trespasses and sins. God breathed life into us. He wakes us up. Now we are in tune with God. Now our spirits are in tune with him, whereas before it was cut off. God raises Yeshua from death, So this is salvation is all about life and death and bringing life out of death. So he goes on, without becoming weak in faith, he contemplated his own body as good as dead, since he was about 100 years old, and the deadness of Sarah's womb. Yet with respect to the promise of God, he did not waver in unbelief. He didn't go back and forth between two opinions, right? That's why I believe faith confession is so important. I believe Abraham exercised that, being fully assured that what God had promised he was able to perform. Therefore, it was also credited to him as righteousness. He believed that God can bring life to his wife, and he believed that, right? Now, not for his sake only that it was credited to him, but for our sake too. So that Paul is saying, this is the kind of faith I want you to have for our sake, right? So he's saying it will be credited as those who believe in him who God raised up from the dead. So all this stuff is about death and life, and salvation is this is the kind of faith that that he's talking about. Right here too, just real quick, I'll back up to here in chapter 4. Now then, Paul says in verse 9 of chapter 4, is this blessing then on the circumcised? Remember, circumcision is a metonymy. It's a word that it's used in association with Jewish identity, and he's speaking to Jewish people here. Is this blessing then on the circumcised or on the uncircumcised also? And we could kind of wrap it up at this point. For we say faith was credited to Abraham as righteousness. What faith? What did he believe? Well, that's what he believed. How then was it credited while he was circumcised or uncircumcised? Well, remember, circumcision is kind of like mikvah or baptism. It doesn't bring righteousness. It's a faith response to the righteousness that we already have, okay, because of what he did for us. So this is a faith response. Circumcision is a faith response, right? How then was it credited while he was circumcised or uncircumcised? Not while he was circumcised, but uncircumcised. And he received the sign of circumcision, a seal of the righteousness of the faith which he had while uncircumcised, so that he might be the father of all who believe without being circumcised, that righteousness might be credited to him. And then he goes on, one last verse, and the father of the circumcision to those who not only are of the circumcision, but also those who follow in the steps of the faith of Abraham. So there's two. There's those who receive physical circumcision and circumcision of the heart. Those are the Jews. And then there's the Gentiles who receive just the circumcision of the heart, which is the primary important thing. Both follow in the faith of Abraham. Some are Jewish, and they're also, remember, in order to be a true Jew, in order to fulfill your destiny as one who is inherently a praiser of God, you have to have this inner transformation. He's not a Jew who is one outwardly; he's a Jew who's one inwardly. Same with the Gentiles; they have to have this inner change, this inner transformation to be able to move into their fullest destiny and be worshipers of God. So that's kind of where we might wrap it up. But I just want the whole story of Abraham. I did want to say, and I'll leave you with this here, and maybe next time we can look at this. Remember, Yeshua is representative man, yes, but more specifically, he is representative Israel. Because you see, the life of Israel is recapitulated in the life of Yeshua. And so he follows in the footsteps of Israel. He is representative Israel, right? And everything he does, is parallel to the nation, except for one thing. Everywhere they fail, he succeeds. And so if you jump over to the book of Matthew, you see Matthew is not speaking in a predictive sense when he says that it might be fulfilled, that it might be fulfilled, that it might be fulfilled. Because when you look up some of those references, there's no prediction about a Messiah coming. What Matthew is saying is that Jesus, Yeshua, fills up the meaning of Israel in his life. And Israel, instead of being replaced, are restored because in him they can now succeed where they have failed before. And they can walk out the covenant of Abraham. And you see them doing that in the book of Acts. The light has shone. They are the people of the light, and now the blessing is going out to the nations. You don't get to the Gentiles until chapter 10 of the book of in the book of Acts. It's all Jewish, right? That's why he said it jokingly. If you went to Peter back in that day and you said to Peter, "Do you think we should evangelize the Gentiles?" Peter would say, "Well, probably. Why would we want to do that? You know, I mean, it was his whole eschatology was wrong. You know, why would we'll just get Israel saved and then we'll worry about them? You know." But God had another plan in mind. But instead of being replaced, they're restored. God promises their success. So Yeshua is representative of Israel. The whole life of Israel is parallel to the whole life of Israel. His life is recapitulated in their life, and their life in his. And this is just, I wanted to just show you, probably have seen these. It's not that original, but it's just that if you look at this here, Yeshua, it says Jesus because it was in the class, so I had to. Yeshua is representative of Israel. He fills up the meaning of Israel's history in his own life. So Abraham has a miraculous son, Isaac, through the barren Sarah. So too Yeshua is born of a miracle through Miriam, right? Yeshua is born in Bethlehem, right? Bethlehem, because Israel's greatest king David is born in Bethlehem, and he becomes Israel's greatest king. Yeshua goes to Egypt. Why? Because Israel goes to Egypt. In Egypt, Pharaoh orders a mass murder of male babies, but Moses, Israel's savior, escapes. So too Yeshua, Israel's savior, is sought after by another Pharaoh to be killed, but he escapes while in Egypt. He is living out the history of Israel in his own life. When Israel is ready to become a nation, she goes to the Red Sea. Israel emerges a free people, a change of status, which the rabbis say mikveh is a change of status. Interesting. So too Yeshua is immersed in the Jordan to begin his mystery of healing and deliverance. By the way, you can characterize Yeshua's ministry by three things: teaching, healing, and casting out demons. Now, why did Yeshua do those three things? It's based on Isaiah 61. He did it because he cares about people, but more specifically, he did it because he was seeking to restore Israel. Remember, he heals. Why? Because Israel succumbed to idolatry. They went into the nations, they disobeyed Moses, and they were infected with demons, and they became demonized. And so Yeshua heals. He's bringing restoration back to Israel. You have to understand, he is representative of Israel here in this thing. Israel then spends 40 years in the wilderness because they refused to believe the spies who spied out the land for 40 years. So too Yeshua spends 40 days in the desert, tested by the enemy, and in the desert he overcomes where Israel fails. Then he goes up to the mountain, the talk on the hill, right, to give an authoritative interpretation of the law. He distills the spirit of the law. He distills it. He brings out its deepest and its fullest meaning, not based on rabbinic interpretation throughout generation to generation. He does this. Authority comes right from God. So also Moses goes up the mountain to receive the law from the people and teach the people. So Yeshua teaches the people because Israel was a teaching nation. Moses taught them, and they were to be a teaching nation to the world. That's why I came first to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. He goes to them first so they can bring the light to the nations. As Moses provided manna in the wilderness, so too Yeshua supplies supernatural bread in a solitary place, feeding the 5,000. So that's where we'll just kind of pick it up. Next time, just on this whole event of the history of Israel being repudiated in Yeshua's life. And then finish up the call of Abraham. Just a few more things. Why the covenant is primary. A little bit about physical circumcision, what that means. I have a great book to quote from, Abraham's Promise by Michael Wishigrod. Powerful on election and the fact that God didn't choose us based on our spiritual or our morality, but really entered into a concrete relationship with a real people group and saved them as a people group physically as well as spiritually too. So we'll pick it up with that and talk a little bit about circumcision, why it's a physical thing. It's very physical. So anyway, that's it. So yeah.